Now look, I've been around politics a long time. I've seen presidents win big and lose big. I've been on both sides of that myself more times than I care to count. But every now and then, something happens that stops you in your tracks. Not because it's loud, and Lord knows we've had plenty of loud, but because it's quiet in a way that should scare you. On February 23rd, 2026, the President of the United States sat down, opened Truth Social, and called the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest court in the land, the final guardian of our Constitution, incompetent. He said he'd start writing their name in lowercase letters. Lowercase as a show of disrespect. Now, I want you to sit with that for a second because most people scrolled right past it. Just another post, just another Monday. But it's not just another Monday. When a sitting president publicly tries to strip the dignity from a co-equal branch of government, not over a beer with friends, not in some off-the-record grumble, but in a written statement to millions of Americans, that is a signal. That's a president telling the country that the court doesn't deserve your respect. And here's what most people missed. He didn't stop at the insult. He claimed the court's ruling against him actually gave him more power than he had before. He said, and these are his words, that he can now do absolutely terrible things to foreign countries. And then, before the birthright citizenship case has even been argued, he told America that the court will get that one wrong too. Let me tell you something. I've disagreed with the Supreme Court. Every president has. But there is a difference between disagreeing with a ruling and waging a campaign to delegitimize the institution itself. And that's the difference between democracy holding and democracy bending. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Now, to understand why this moment matters so much, you've got to understand how we got here. And it didn't start last Friday. It started with a decision to go around Congress. See, the Constitution is pretty clear on this. Article 1, Section 8, the power to lay tariffs and regulate commerce with foreign nations belongs to Congress. That's not an opinion. That's the document. The founders put it there because they understood that the power to tax is the power closest to the people, and it should stay with the people's representatives. But last year, President Trump decided he didn't need Congress. He invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, a 1977 law designed for genuine national emergencies, sanctions, asset freezes. It was never written for terrorists. Not once in its history had any president used it to impose sweeping import duties on the entire world. I know something about trade. I negotiated NAFTA. I brought China into the WTO framework. And I can tell you trade policy is complicated. It affects millions of jobs, and it requires the kind of deliberation that only Congress can provide. So when the case reached the Supreme Court, Learning Resources Inc. versus Trump, the question was straightforward. Does AEPA give the president authority to impose tariffs unilaterally? And on February 20th, 2026, 6 justices said no. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion. And here's what people need to understand. This wasn't a liberal-conservative split. Roberts, Gorsuch, Barrett, 3 of the most conservative justices on that bench, joined with Kagan, Sotomayor, and Jackson, 6-3. The court said AEPA contains no reference to tariffs or duties, and no president before had ever read it that way. Now, that should have been the end of it. A clear constitutional boundary reaffirmed by a bipartisan majority. But within hours, President Trump signed a new executive order, a 10% global tariff under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, and raised it to 15% the very next day. And this is where things start to get complicated. Now, I want to do something here that I think matters. I want to walk you through exactly what the president wrote on the morning of February 23rd. Not a summary, not somebody else's interpretation. his words. He opened by writing, and I want you to pay attention to this. The Supreme Court, lowercase. Then he added in parentheses that he'd be using lowercase letters for a while, based on a complete lack of respect. Now look, you might think that's petty. You might even laugh at it. But when the President of the United States deliberately strips the capitalization from a co-equal branch of government as a public act of contempt, that's not a typo. That's a message. He went on to say the ruling was ridiculous, dumb, and very internationally divisive. Then came the part most people glossed over. He claimed the court accidentally and unwittingly gave him far more powers than he had before. He said he could now use what he called licenses to do, and these are his exact words, absolutely terrible things to foreign countries. He called the court incompetent. He said they did a great job for the wrong people and should be ashamed of themselves, but then exempted what he called the Great Three. That's Justices Thomas, Kavanaugh, and Alito, the three dissenters. He sorted sitting justices into loyal and disloyal right there in public. And then he went further. He turned to the birthright citizenship case. Oral arguments aren't even scheduled until April 1st. And told the country the court will find a way to come to the wrong conclusion, one that will make China and various other nations happy and rich. We've got to remember something. This isn't a pundit on cable news. This isn't some anonymous post. This is the sitting president of the United States publicly prejudging a case, attacking the judiciary, and telling Americans which justices are loyal and which ones aren't. Let me tell you, that changes things. Here's the honest truth. Every president who has ever served has had a moment where the Supreme Court told them something they did not want to hear. Every single one, and I include myself in that. There were rulings during my time in office that frustrated me deeply, decisions I thought were wrong on the merits, wrong on the timing, wrong on the consequences. But here's what I understood, and what every president before me understood. You don't take a wrecking ball to the institution because you lost the case. You go back to your desk. You find another way. You work with Congress. You make your argument to the American people through the democratic process. That's the job. When the court rules against you, you have two choices. You can demonstrate to the country that the system works, that no one, not even the president, is above the law. Or you can try to convince people that the system itself is broken because it didn't bend to your will. Those are very different paths, and they lead to very different Americas. What President Trump did on February 23rd was the second path. He didn't just disagree with the ruling, he called the court incompetent. He ranked the justices loyal and disloyal for the whole world to see. He told his supporters that 6 justices, including 3 he considers conservative, betrayed the country. And he prejudged a case that hasn't even been argued yet, telling Americans in advance that the court will reach the wrong conclusion on birthright citizenship. Now, let me tell you something from experience. When a president publicly sorts justices into good and bad, that is not commentary, that is pressure. Every justice on that bench knows millions of people read that post, and the message is unmistakable. Rule with me, and you're one of the Great Three. Rule against me, and you're incompetent. That's not how a president leads. That's not how a democracy holds. Now, let me take you somewhere. Most people don't go when they talk about this, because what happened on February 23rd isn't just about one post or one president's temper. It's about what happens to a republic slowly, gradually, almost invisibly, when the executive branch decides the judiciary is the enemy. Let me tell you something. Franklin Roosevelt, one of the greatest presidents in American history, a Democrat I admire enormously, tried to pack the Supreme Court in 1937. He was frustrated. The court had struck down key parts of the New Deal. He had just won re-election in a landslide. And even with all that political capital, his own party said no. Democrats in the Senate killed court packing because they understood something bigger than the moment. You don't reshape the judiciary to serve the president. You protect its independence even when it rules against you. Richard Nixon, during Watergate, wanted to defy the court. His own advisers told him to comply. He did, and the system held. I went through my own difficult chapter, the independent counsel investigation, the rulings that went against me, the political pain of it all. And I can tell you there were nights I questioned the fairness of every bit of it. But I never, not once, went before the American people and told them the courts were illegitimate. Because I understood that the moment a president does that, he isn't just undermining a ruling, he's undermining the only institution that stands between ordered liberty and the raw exercise of power. What President Trump did is different from anything we've seen. He didn't just criticize a decision, he publicly sorted justices into loyalists and traitors. He called the institution incompetent. And then, and this is the part that should concern every American, he told the country in advance that the court's next major ruling on birthright citizenship will be wrong. Before a single oral argument, before a single brief has been weighed, that's not disagreement. That's delegitimization by design. And here's what I've learned in all my years. Democratic erosion doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't arrive with a bang. It happens one norm at a time, one institution at a time, one post at a time, until one day you look around and realize the guardrails are gone. Now, I want to be honest about something because I think it's important. I've been in politics my whole adult life. I know what a tantrum looks like, and I know what a strategy looks like. And what President Trump did on February 23rd, that wasn't chaos. That was calculation. Let me walk you through it. Step 1. He reframed a clear legal defeat as a hidden victory. He told his supporters the court accidentally gave him more power. That's not an offhand remark. That's a narrative. It tells the base, don't worry, I'm still winning even when the courts say, I lost. Step 2. He redirected public anger away from himself and toward the judiciary. Suddenly, the story isn't about whether the president overstepped his authority. The story is about whether the court is competent. Step 3. He divided the court publicly into allies and enemies, creating a loyalty framework that puts pressure on every justice in every future case. And step 4. He pre-delegitimized the birthright citizenship ruling before it even exists, so that no matter what the court decides, in April, his supporters will already believe the fix was in. Now look at what happened on the policy side. Within hours of the AIPA ruling, the administration pivoted to Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. A 10% tariff raised to 15% within 24 hours, and signals that licenses and other mechanisms could go even further. That's not the behavior of an administration caught off guard. That's contingency planning. They knew they might lose at the court, and they had the next move ready. Here's what worries me as someone who is governed. This strategy creates what I'd call a permission structure for ignoring judicial authority. If you convince enough Americans that the court is incompetent, that its rulings are politically motivated, that only 3 justices are trustworthy, then the next time a ruling comes down that this president doesn't like, defiance becomes thinkable. And once that door opens, it is extraordinarily difficult to close. And let's not forget the economic dimension. Markets are already uncertain. Businesses don't know what tariff rate applies tomorrow. There's a $133 billion refund question hanging over importers. American consumers are paying more. And none of this went through Congress. Not a single vote, not a single hearing. That's not governments. That's improvisation with people's livelihoods. So, where does this go? Let me be straight with you, I don't have a crystal ball. But I've been around long enough to see the patterns. And I can tell you there are a few roads ahead of us, and they lead to very different places. The first road, and this is the one I hope we take, is that Congress steps up. The Constitution gave the legislature the power over tariffs for a reason. If the Supreme Court just told the president he can't use IEPA for trade policy, then Congress has an opportunity and I'd say a responsibility to legislate clearly, define the boundaries, reclaim the authority the founders intended. That's bipartisan work. There are Republicans and Democrats who believe in congressional prerogative. This is the moment to act on it. The second road is the one we're on right now. The administration keeps finding alternative legal authorities. Section 122, Section 301, emergency declarations to impose tariffs without congressional approval. Every new mechanism gets challenged in court, and we enter a cycle of litigation, uncertainty, executive orders, and more litigation. Businesses can't plan. Allies can't trust our trade commitments. And the constitutional question never gets resolved. It just keeps shifting to the next statute. The third road is the one that concerns me most in the near term. The birthright citizenship case arrives at the Supreme Court, with oral arguments set for April 1st. President Trump has already told the country, the court will get it wrong. If the court rules against him, which based on over a century of precedent under the 14th Amendment is the most likely outcome, we will face a full-blown legitimacy crisis manufactured in advance. The president will have preloaded his supporters with the belief that the ruling was corrupt before a single word was spoken in that courtroom. And if the court rules with him, then the pre-attack worked as intimidation. The fourth road is the longest and most dangerous. The pattern of executive-judicial confrontation accelerates. Each ruling becomes a battlefield. Each justice becomes a political figure in the public eye, loyal or disloyal. And we find ourselves in a constitutional confrontation, unlike anything this country has seen since the 1930s, but without the institutional goodwill that ultimately resolved that crisis. I don't know which path we'll take, but I know this. The ball is in Congress's court now, and it's in yours. Let me close with something personal. I've spent most of my life in public service. I've made mistakes, some of them very public. I've had moments I'm proud of, and moments I wish I could do over. But through all of it, there's one thing I never lost faith in, and that's the idea that America is governed by laws, not by the will of any single person. Not me, not any president, not anyone. Now, I'm not here to demonize President Trump. This is bigger than one man. The real question, the one that keeps me up at night, if I'm being honest, is whether we as Americans still believe in the basic architecture of this democracy. Do we still believe that no one is above the law? Do we still believe that the branches of government are supposed to check each other even when it's inconvenient, even when it's politically costly? Do we still believe that disagreement within the system is a feature of democracy, not a flaw? Because here's what I've learned in decades of public life. The hardest moments in a democracy aren't when things go wrong. Things go wrong all the time. The hardest moments are when people, leaders, citizens, institutions decide they don't have to play by the rules anymore. That's when the fabric starts to tear. What happened on February 23rd, 2026 was a tear. Maybe a small one, maybe one that can be mended, but only if enough people see it for what it is and say, no, this is not acceptable. Not from any president, not from any party. So here's what I'll ask of you. Stay informed. Not angry, informed. Vote not out of fear, but out of responsibility. Hold every leader accountable, including the ones you agree with, especially the ones you agree with. Because democracy doesn't survive on autopilot. It survives because ordinary people decide every single day that it's worth protecting. I still believe in this country. I still believe we can right the ship. Not because I'm naive. Lord knows I've seen too much for that. But because I've seen Americans do it before. We've corrected course after wars, after scandals, after economic collapse. We've done it when the odds were long and the divisions were deep. We can do it again. But only if we choose to.